We have several decades of tremendous research by our scholars into the evidences that are to be found concerning the Book of Mormon.
Peter came to me one day and said, you know, Farms has a tremendous amount of research on the Book of Mormon that really hasn't hit the light of day that would be fascinating to put into a documentary. I said, well, Peter, let's do it then. Let's make the film.
I was invited to a meeting at Farms with Peter Johnson, and that was my first introduction to this project.
First Nephi is an absolutely fabulous record that is not only a potent spiritual record, but is also great dramatic literature.
When I heard of this project, I thought, wow, this is a real opportunity.
The making of this documentary took many years, where originally it should have taken only a few months.
When we arrived in Marab, we put our bags into our hotel. We left and went out to an important temple, the Temple of Mahram Bilqis.
It started out as a great day. We went out to the Queen of Sheba's palace that were being uncovered.
We filmed around that temple, then we came back to the hotel.
As we arrived at the hotel, somebody ran out and said, there's been a terrible bombing in America.
And somebody behind the desk said, an airplane has hit the White House. The information was wrong, but the seriousness of the event was correct.
We went to our hotel rooms and turned on the television, and there was news coverage of the events in New York and Washington of 9/11.
We could see everything that was going on, and here we are. We're in Yemen.
It was almost like a dream. I couldn't believe what we were seeing.
We saw the second plane hit, and I was quite shocked. I think I felt numb.
We looked around at each other, and I said, well, we're in Yemen. Now what?
And there was much discussion about what we should do. And it was decided that the safest place for us to be was in the desert.
We had called the American embassy in Sana'a, and they said, don't come into the city because you'll be too much of a target, and don't go to the airport because there'll really be a target there. The morning after 9/11, I left my hotel room and went outside. We had a contingent of about 18 or so Yemeni military guards. And I walked over to the military commander and I looked at him, and I was trying to be as cheerful as one could be that morning, and said good morning, and he looked at me and tears welled up in his eyes. And he says, I'm so sorry. And I said, we're sorry too.
On our first day in Yemen, we went to the ancient city of Sana'a, which is one of the oldest cities in the world.
We felt when we were there that we had stepped back in time at least 2,000 years, if not more.
It was like the airplane that we flew over to Yemen on was a time machine.
For me, going to a place like that, it's really interesting and thrilling. I was intrigued by everything that was going on around us.
One of the highlights of the trip was to visit the Nahom burial site.
Shooting in Nahom was an amazing experience because this is a name I grew up knowing.
We had with us the chief archaeologist of Yemen. Abdu was his name, and he had discovered mummies buried in this area, had dated them back to around the 600 BC period.
And to wake up one morning and find yourself in Yemen, in Nahom, it was fascinating.
What was especially striking to me was to stand in places where I could look around and think to myself, Lehi and Sarai must have seen these same hills. They must have seen these same mountains. It was really a privilege for me, once in a lifetime privilege, for me to come into an area like that where they must have traveled.
There it was, Nahom, where Ishmael was buried.
I'm sitting in Nahum burial ground that was discovered in 1994. The people who passed through this area and died, they will bring to this burial and buried here, whether they were Yemenis or foreigners from the north, from Mediterranean, and from someplace else.
The finding of Nahum strikes me as just a tremendously significant discovery.
The gazetteers of Joseph Smith's day listed no such place.
What it really is a kind of prediction by the Book of Mormon of something that we ought to find.
Now, the chances of finding that exact name from that exact time in that exact place by random chance are just astronomical.
And to find it in the right location at the right time is a really striking bullseye for the book. And there are those who say that the book has no archaeological substantiation. That's a spectacular substantiation right there, it seems to me. Something that would have been unexpected, that it's so unlikely that Joseph Smith could have woven into his story on his own.
The Arabian desert is a life-threatening place because it's hot, because it is remote, and there's very little water.
What was striking to me was to see mountains of sand packed against mountains of rock. And it was really a stunning sight to see how sand and rock have conspired against those who try to eke out a living in that sort of an environment.
I was really excited when we first arrived. Kind of the road just seemed to end, and we got out and our drivers all started letting the air out of their tires. And they said, we're just gonna go. We're going there.
For 360 degrees, all you could see were sand dunes.
The dunes just rolled away so gently. And with the sun being so low coming across, the sky was blue and the sand was just blowing. It was gorgeous.
This is the Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter. It lives up to its name because of the lack of vegetation in this part of the world.
The heat is terrible. We can hardly imagine it. Constantly sapping your strength, dehydrating you, is a truly terrible thing. And the temperatures rise to very, very high levels.
You deal with the threat of sands, which can kill also anybody or cover anybody under the sand. And when they come very strong.
Sandstorms would be terrible. They're not just minor affairs. They can be choking.
I can't imagine anything that would be more stressful to deal with as you curled up next to a camel with your cloak over your face and tried to wait it out.
Because of 9/11, had we not shot Yemen first, we would never have been able to get back there to make the film. And so I think it's fortuitous that despite all of the world conditions that were going on, we nevertheless managed to get into Yemen, obtain our shooting, and get out.
To have gone where we did in 2001 was actually a gift to us. And I know that there are people who worked on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean to make certain that we were protected, that people were aware of our presence, and their efforts made to make certain that we succeeded.
We wouldn't have been able to tell this story had we not gone to Yemen. And we consider that a pretty special blessing that we were able to get there. It took us another 3 years before we could obtain permissions and make arrangements to go back to the Middle East and complete our shooting. We found 2 or 3 places that are really good candidates for Bountiful, but one of them that everybody feels the strongest about is a place called Wadi Syke.
To get there, you drive a very long ways and then you go on a boat. And you put the camera way up high and the camera's doing all this stuff and you just get to go in there, and it was just amazing to be there.
It was a pretty exciting moment, I think, for all of us when we came around a little bit of a corner in the coast and then Wadi Syke opened up.
When we finally came around to where we were seeing Wadi Syke, it just popped out to me just how I'd imagined as I'd read the Book of Mormon, the land of Bountiful. That was it.
A lot of the people have talked about the heat of the desert, but I've never been to any place so hot as Wadi Syke.
Shooting in Wadi Syke was one of the more challenging days that we had. It was really hot and really humid.
By the time we'd reached a place a mile to the west of where the boats were, and were filming there, it seemed apparent to me that, well, I needed water, and I suspect that everybody else did. So I asked a couple of people, "You still have some water? You still have some water?" And the response was, "No."
I'm carrying the camera around, which weighs about 40 pounds and is not very easy to carry. And then we've got backpacks and tripods, and we're carrying that around. And then we're walking up hills. Just extremely difficult location to shoot.
Gary Baird, one of the scholars, a botanist, I remember was sitting there, and we didn't realize that we were all getting very dehydrated. He was sitting on a rock, and I was conducting an interview with him, and then he would get lightheaded and have to put his head down between his knees, collect himself, and then he would raise up again, and then he would continue on with his response to the interview.
Some of these canopy trees are even found here in Wadi Syke. They're actually quite common along the base of the escarpment.
So I walked off the high cliff area where we were, went back along the beach for about a mile, found some water, as much as I could carry, and brought it back. And you know what that did? It just made the film crew keep going. I mean, they didn't say, "Thanks, let's all go back to the boat." They turned, went another direction to keep going. These guys are really tough.
In the escarpment mountains up here, there are, in the cliffs, there are cavities in which there are honeybees that nest.
The wild bees would build their hives often in the face of the cliffs of the escarpment.
Based on the vegetation, there appeared to be quite a few things that looked bee pollinated to me.
Making honey requires vegetation. It requires plants that depend upon bees for pollination.
There were many of the species that were producing copious amounts of pollen and also copious amounts of nectar.
The abundant wildflowers here led to a lot of honey being produced. And even today, the natives, the local people, will scale down the cliffs with ropes and gather the honey out of the caverns. Nephi's description of Bountiful as being fruitful, as being a land rich in honey, absolutely accurate.
I think it was an exciting experience for the crew to shoot in the Dhofar region and to be in that area where Bountiful must have been.
To be driving through that countryside, to be going up and down those hills, we thought, this is where it happened. Somewhere along this coastline is where Nephi began to build his boat.
I think we all felt a real kinship with Lehi and Soraya and their family. Once we returned home from the trip, the focus turned to editing this show. And that was going to be a real challenge. We had hours upon hours of footage, including over 20 hours of interview footage.
A documentary film can be dramatic in nature. It is not a scripted film. It's something that you know what you're after, you go for, and then you really create it in editing in terms of the pacing of the film and so forth.
One of the advantages to having several scholars to cut to was the ability to have a different pace, a different feel for different segments of the film. Sometimes a more rapid pace was appropriate, other times a slower, more deliberate pace was better.
I made a decision to shoot the scholars against blue screen or green screen, which allowed us then to replace the background with anything that we wanted. And in this case, I wanted to do artwork.
When Peter Johnson came to us and was presenting us with his project, he presented us with the opportunity to do some visual effects work.
The director wanted to have an interesting feel to this piece. He wanted to shoot the scholars in a different environment than their offices or wherever he happened to find them. So he shot them all on a green screen, and we were able to take the green out and preserve just the scholar. We were then able to place backgrounds behind them that illustrated the subject material they were talking about. If they're talking about Jerusalem or about the plates, whatever, we could put that image behind them.
It's impossible not to love this story. For one thing, Nephi begins his record in the very first sentence by putting himself in the context of a family.
In a sense, we're all Lehi's family because we all have tensions in our family and we all have struggles over who's going to be in charge and what we're going to do and what the goals of the family are. And we see this reflected quite nicely in the Book of Mormon. It's a real family.
We see sibling rivalry, we see tension, and we can imagine what that does to a mother.
The dynamics in the family are really interesting, that the loyalty of the two oldest sons, Laman and Lemuel, seems to be much more allied with that of the ruling class in Judah than with their own father. And they see him as a kind of class traitor.
But it's also a microcosm of Judea as a whole, because within Judea you have different attitudes towards prophecy, the Lord, the scriptures, the temple, all of these different things.
When they first leave Jerusalem, they're leaving their inheritance, and the oldest, Laman, is the birthright son. He's the one that would receive a double portion if he were staying.
They weren't convinced it was wise to leave their possessions. They weren't convinced that Jerusalem would be destroyed, and they weren't convinced there was a better place to go.
But you also see another characteristic of Middle Eastern families, and that is the loyalty to the father. Laman and Lemuel did not want to go on this journey.
Even though there were rebukes, voices, and even angelic appearances, they soon could brush that aside.
I think what you see in Lehi is a very wealthy person living on the outskirts of Jerusalem who has two older, spoiled sons who've grown up quite comfortable in Jerusalem, and they are looking forward to the day when they will inherit all that property.
And yet they went with their father because of loyalty to the father is absolute in the Middle East. They take out their anxiety and their animosity to their father on their brother Nephi.
I wanted the viewer to feel, when they looked upon the face of Nephi, to feel that engaging testimony that Nephi translates through his words in the Book of Mormon, and to feel that his life and his words are directed right at me. I felt that doing drawings, in a way, paralleled scholarly work, in that drawings are sort of a skeletal version. It's much like the research that one would do of ancient people, where we find little clues of things, but much is left to the imagination. One way that my eyes have been opened, or perhaps just redirected their focus when I go about doing artwork from the Book of Mormon is, number one, the characters. The more time you spend contemplating who these people were, the more I think it empowers you as an artist to express that. I feel like I have more specific things to say about Nephi, about Lehi, about Sariah. And these two characters, Daniel and Ezekiel, I felt would have been young at the time that Jerusalem was taken into captivity. I wanted to express this sense of loss, this sense of tragedy, of losing your nation, your home, families, and most of all, the core of all of that, which is your religion.
On this project, I collaborated with Nick Gazdick as a co-composer.
Lehi, Sariah, their whole family, of course, they were a Middle Eastern family.
There was the initial demand or idea of using indigenous music, both to the period and the region.
My father was a diplomat, and I grew up in places like Tehran, Iran, and Pakistan.
The problem was that the Saudi Peninsula music of the time was too limiting. It was mainly a single chanted line with percussion.
We used some instruments that you probably wouldn't normally hear.
We looked at a number of exotic scales that, if they don't directly hail from the region, could be attributable in people's minds to the region.
I grew up hearing these sounds, so when I was able to spot the film with Peter Johnson, the director, and Arlen and I, it was like all these sounds came back to me.
Those materials and those building blocks, we started trying to think of themes that anchored themselves to certain aspects of the show.
I write my thematic material on the keys, and he writes it from head to hand, or he'll play his sax.
And underlying the fabric of all of that is we had to imbue the music overall with a sense of belief, with the feelings we have about the people of the Book of Mormon.
We were struggling with what we call it the landfall theme. It was the final theme, it was the big climax of the film. I met with Arlen that afternoon, and we sort of lamented the fact that, that theme wasn't working. He knew it, I knew it, Peter knew it. As I got home, I just thought, you know what? It just needs to be percussive. I just kept feeling that it's got to be a percussive instrument. So I just started out with basically that rhythm.
Making the film required its own sense of dedication and determination and faith.
Lehi and Sariah faced that desert, and that required a certain determination, a certain faith to go forward. In a way, our filming team was being asked to exhibit the same qualities, the same characteristics that they had exhibited hundreds of years ago. To be patient, to push, not to give up, and that the end result would be something wonderful and grand.